CBS News, this is David Jackson. A flurry of activity at Cape Canaveral on the eve of Space Shuttle Mission 4. It was brought on by the weather, as we hear from Reed Collins.
A rolling lightning storm battered the launch site for more than an hour late today. Lightning crashed around the shuttle, setting off alarms responded to by fire engines and ambulances. Nothing caught fire, but during one of the storm passages, there was hail pelting on the shuttle and on its temperamental tiles. Inspection teams are trying now to assess the damage. NASA is considering rotating the big service structure taken away this morning back to its service position, which would give the inspectors a closer look. Thus far, there's no visible damage, but the weather was severe and may have put a crimp in what had been a smooth countdown. Astronauts Mattingly and Hartsfield are due to go to bed 1 hour from now. There's nothing they or anybody can do about the weather. Reed Collins, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
Space Center this afternoon as a heavy thunderstorm passed over Cape Canaveral. It hammered some tiny depressions into the tail and wing sections of Shuttle Columbia, scheduled for its fourth and final launch 12 hours from now. ABC's Vic Ratner reports from the center that repairs are proceeding.
NASA's fixing the hail damage on the Columbia in about the same way you'd fix small quarter-inch dents or dimples in the wall at home, with something like spackle to smooth out the surface of the tiles. About 400 of the shuttle's 30,000 heat tiles are affected. There was some concern for a while, but engineers here are now confident that the job won't delay the launch. NASA had set aside 5 built-in holds or rest and repair periods totaling 24 hours in the countdown, and this is the first time any quick fixes have been needed. Vic Ratner, ABC News at the Kennedy Space Center.
Blastoff is scheduled for 11 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. ABC News live coverage will start 10 minutes beforehand. I'll have more after this.
San Antonio, Texas.
From
It's
ABC
midnight.
News, I'm Palmer Payne. Hailstones the size of peas pelted the Kennedy Space Center as a thunderstorm passed through Cape Canaveral, leaving about 400 impressions in the heat-shielding tiles of Space Shuttle Columbia. With blastoff scheduled 10 hours from now, ABC's Vic Ratner reports the damage is expected to be repaired in plenty of time.
It was quite a scare for a while, but NASA has now had a look at the tile damage caused by the hailstorm out at Pad 39, and indications are there's nothing that can't be fixed so that there can be a scheduled launch on time. Engineers have found some dimples, NASA says they're smaller than dents, in the tiles on the wing and tail. NASA says they can repair that damage, which they call minor, and that it won't hold up the countdown preparations, which have been going smoothly up till now. Vic Ratner, ABC News at the Kennedy Space Center.
ABC News live coverage of the fourth and final flight of Columbia will start at 10 minutes before 11 Eastern Time. I'll have more after this.
Here's the latest from ABC News. I'm Chet Martin. The fourth and final test flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia, a 7-day mission, is scheduled for launch from Florida's Kennedy Space Center 2.5 hours from now. A thunderstorm yesterday, accompanied by high winds, battered the Columbia with hail, putting hundreds of small dents in the shuttle's protective heat shield tiles. But that damage was quickly repaired. ABC's Bob Walker is at Kennedy. Bob, how's the weather look this morning, and how's the countdown going?
Both couldn't be better, Chet. You wouldn't know there was a storm here last night at all. We've had a spectacular sunrise. It's a bright, beautiful sunny morning here on the Space Coast of Central Florida. 83 degrees, the predicted temperature at liftoff time. A countdown 2 hours, 9 minutes, 15 seconds and counting. And we have 2 more 10-minute built-in holds. Things couldn't look better, Chet. And the astronauts are about to go inside the space shuttle itself.
Our thanks to ABC's Bob Walker at the Kennedy Space Center. ABC News begins live coverage of this morning's launch of the Space Shuttle at 10:50 Eastern Daylight Time. Now this.
Reach in Houston.
CBS News, this is Paul Lockwood. 2 hours to go and everything looks good for this morning's scheduled launch of the Space Shuttle Columbia. The latest from correspondent Reed Collins at the Kennedy Space Center.
With a blazing sun shining through the cockpit windows, Ken Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield are in the cockpit of Columbia going through their checklist. The test conductor has been busy, checking the scores of consoles in the firing room. A drum fire of communication, professionally curt.
DOFS. DOFS, go. AFM. AFM, go.
Minutes before liftoff, these tasks will be taken over by computers whose question-answer sequence is beyond human calculation. The count continuing toward an on-time liftoff in less than 2 hours. Reed Collins, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
It's 9 a.m.
CBS News, I'm Deborah Potter. The final preparations are now underway for the launch of the Space Shuttle Columbia, scheduled 1 hour from now. We get the latest from Reed Collins at Kennedy Space Center.
The sun is reaching toward the zenith and some fluffy clouds are moving in from the Atlantic. But weather's not expected to be a factor if the launch is on time an hour from now. Ken Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield are in the Columbia's cabin going through their pages of pre-flight checks. They awakened at 6:10 this morning, had bacon and eggs, a medical checkup, and put on their flight suits. A ripple of applause followed the band that brought them out here to the pad. In the access room next to the ship was a sign saying War Eagle Country, a reference to the fact that each man is an alumnus of Auburn. And now, each is about to join that more select company, the handful who have flown Columbia, the spaceship. The count continues, and all goes well. Reed Collins, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
You were talking a little bit ago, Doug, about the fact this is the last time they'll be wearing spacesuits. It's also the last time that there'll be ejection seats on board the space shuttle, something that could be used in the event of some sort of catastrophic failure up to about 120,000 feet. And yesterday, there was a lot of talk about, well, what's going to happen if you take out the ejection seats and something goes wrong? And Glenn Lunny, the shuttle project manager, was very honest when he said we would simply have to try to ditch the shuttle. And obviously, they think now that they've got the thing so far under control that that kind of opportunity just will not occur.
That's a mark of their...
We're about 32 seconds away from, in fact, we have resumed the countdown now, about 8.5 minutes away. The ground computers are now sending commands on board the shuttle, getting those 5 flight computers all the data they'll need for this 7-day flight into space.
It's an interesting mark of their confidence that they're willing to get rid of those ejection seats. As a matter of fact, in some of the earliest flights, they specifically tested the ejection system. They were very concerned the escape towers on the Mercury flights wouldn't work. They were also worried about the ejection seats on the Gemini flights. Well, now they're going to dump them entirely on this next space shuttle mission. It's an effort to cut down on weight. Now, if you've seen pictures of the shuttle from the last mission, you'll notice that the largest of the 3 boosters, the one in the middle, is now orange. They didn't paint it that way. They just got rid of the white paint to cut down on weight. They wanted to take the weight of the paint out of there. That's the reason they're also not going to be wearing their spacesuits on the next flight. That's also the reason that they're getting rid of the ejection seats. They're hoping to put that much weight, that much more weight into the payloads. That's how much confidence they have in the space shuttle.
That's also one of the reasons that they're going to be taking off at a 28-degree inclination to the equator, which may not mean anything to anybody, but sort of picture the fact that the shuttle will not be orbiting far north or far south of the equatorial line. One of the reasons is payload weight, the military payload on board, the commercial payload from McDonnell Douglas, which someday may help in diabetes research. Also, they want to test aerodynamics, and this is going to be the strongest test yet for the shuttle on its launch and on its landing. They want to give this craft all the tests they can give while they have the chance in this test phase. That's one of the reasons they'll be doing more thermal testing this time, too, doing the barbecue roll again. And we found last time that when the payload bay was exposed to the cold of space, deep space, for hours upon hours, that it did have some effect on the craft. It may have been responsible for blowing some of the payload bay cameras. It also may have been responsible for some of the problems they had trying to close the payload bay door one time. Some of the latches may have frozen. They are now retracting the orbiter access arm. About 6.5 minutes to go here to the launch of Columbia. We are waiting for mission control. The voice, Hugh Harris, astronaut.
At the 6-minute point, the crew will perform the auxiliary power unit pre-start, which consists of positioning a number of switches and verifying that they are in the proper position, then throwing the 3 propellant isolation valve switches, which allows the hydrazine fuel to start flowing from the tank toward the APUs. Coming up on the 6-minute point,
Minus 6 minutes.
T-minus 6 minutes and counting.
Well, the orbiter auxiliary power unit should be started now.
Pilot Henry Hartsfield has been asked to perform the APU pre-start.
Of course, you might remember from past flights that there's been a problem every time on launch with APU number 3. Apparently a water boiler cools down. It freezes up on launch. It's something that's been unique to the launch. The APU number 3 has been shut down almost every time. There's always been concern that when they try to coming back in reentry, when the APUs are turned back on, that there would be some problem, but there never has been. But it's a phenomenon that NASA still doesn't understand, and it brings up still the complexity of the spacecraft, and I think we could go on for years, and little what we call anomalies might occur. I know on the first flight we had computers that were 1/25 seconds apart. They were just simply not talking at the same time, but that caused a delay in the flight. It was simply something that NASA didn't understand, and I don't think after 4 test flights, the folks at NASA would tell us that they know everything about this spacecraft. It's a lot more complex than Apollo.
And that's the question that so many people have been asking me. What is the difference between this flight, a test flight, and the next flight? This is the shakedown flight, the last time they're actually going to be testing things out. This is the last time that they think they're going to have to check and see, is this working properly? The next time it's fully operational, they won't be testing anything out. They won't be trying these thermal tests and so on. So that's one of the main objectives of this flight, that the thermal test. They're going to try the barbecue roll and so on to try to see how it holds up under the heat in outer space.
It's a beautiful day at Cape Kennedy. Seeing pictures of the Space Shuttle Columbia, its large orange external tank, its 2 white solid rocket boosters. Rather misty at Kennedy, but we should have a great launch. We should be able to keep sight of Columbia with the chase planes. Let's go to you, Harris.
T-minus 4 minutes, 15 seconds, and counting.
In about 45 seconds, transferring orbiter to internal power.
4 minutes and 30 seconds, the main fuel valve heaters were turned off in preparation for engine start. T-minus 4 minutes and counting. 4.
No, we touched briefly, too, on the experiments on board. There's something called the Getaway Special, experiments from the University of Iowa. They'll be taking up things like houseflies, brine shrimp, algae, duckweed, seeing how zero-G affects these organisms, which may not seem important to humans right now, but something very interesting occurred after STS number 3. Remember houseflies they took up? Well, they found since then, doing tests over at the University of Houston, that their reproduction dropped 57% after their space flight. And, of course, if we're going to be sending men up to a manned space station, a permanent station, something we're going to have to consider is what effect it will have on their bodies. And although I don't think anyone's going to say that that's going to be the situation for humans, but it's the type of things they're looking for. The type the Russians found out with long-term space travel that there was effect on white blood cells. And tests on small organisms will enable us to get a better idea of what humans might face up there.
Well, the orbiter is now on internal power seconds ago. We're now at T-minus 3 minutes from launch. Everything seems to be going well down at the Cape, and once again, the weather is beautiful out there. It looks like the conditions for launch.
2 minutes, 54 seconds. The liquid oxygen valve for filling the external tank is closed and pressurization has begun.
Now they're putting the liquid oxygen in the tank. In just a moment, they'll be retracting that oxygen vent hood. The thing on top of the main booster, that main orange booster, will come popping off like a cork coming off of a bottle, seemingly pulled off by a cord.
The fuel cell ground supply of oxygen and hydrogen has been terminated, and the vehicle is now using its onboard supply.
In just about 20 seconds,
the gaseous oxygen vent arm has been
pressurizing liquid hydrogen.
2 minutes, 15 seconds and counting. The main engines have been moved to start position. The astronauts have cleared the caution and memory warnings in their onboard computers and verified there are no unexpected errors. T-minus 2 minutes and counting. The astronauts are configuring the auxiliary power units for liftoff. The liquid hydrogen vent valve has been closed and flight pressurization underway. T-minus 1 minute, 45 seconds. The computer will automatically verify the readiness of the main engine to start at T-minus 1 minute.
Of course, the next big key here is coming about 28 seconds before the launch, when we will be going for the ground launch sequencer for the 4 primary computers on board Columbia to start sending data back down to the ground. That is primarily the key point in the countdown, because after then, the chance of stopping the countdown is diminished, and of course, there'll be a go at that point for launch or no go. But so far, things have been going so well, and it's so unlike the past 3 flights. There have been so many little quirks that came up in the first 3 flights, and this time it's been simply fantastic.
Counting.
1 minute away.
The firing system for the sound suppression water system on the pad is armed.
Once again, 28 seconds, T-minus 28 seconds, our next critical point. Don't know how many countdowns have been stopped at that point.
T-minus 45 seconds. We're 14 seconds away from switching command of the countdown from the ground computers to the onboard computers. And the development flight instrumentation recorders are on. T-minus 35 seconds.
Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield getting ready to get the jolt of their life, because the explosion that takes place when the shuttle goes up is simply amazing, nothing like we've seen before. That hydrogen and oxygen fuel really pushes it up. Of course, a few seconds up, we'll see it start to make its familiar roll as it heads toward its orbit 130 miles, nautical miles, above the Earth, an orbit it will maintain for 7 days.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine ignition. 4, 3, 2, 1. And we have solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of America's space shuttle on its fourth mission, and we have cleared the tower.
You couldn't say it any better than you, Harris. We're getting a beautiful picture of Columbia. The orange, bright glow from the engines, the main engines coming down. Of course, that beautiful white, large puff of smoke that we saw as the engines were switched on, starting to make its roll.
26 seconds, roll maneuver completed.
In about 20 seconds,
1 nautical mile an hour.
The shuttle will be facing its most severe dynamic pressure. It'll already be 26,000 feet high. Only 53 seconds in the flight to give you some indication of how fast this thing moves. It'll be only 1.9 nautical miles downrange, but facing severe pressure.
Those two solid rocket boosters consuming 11,000 pounds of fuel a second. Now imagine that's about 2 million times the rate at which fuel is burned by your car.
Still looking good, throttling the engine. Give it a go, it's throttle up.
Going very well so far. Large white plume of smoke trailing Columbia.
1 minute, 10 seconds. Columbia now 7 nautical miles in altitude, 4 nautical miles downrange.
About a minute away from the separation of those two solid rocket boosters, which should drop into the Atlantic Ocean.
20 seconds. Columbia now 9 nautical miles in altitude, 6 nautical miles downrange.
And as is being seen here, the shuttle is seems to be traveling almost horizontally on our screen.
1 minute, 30 seconds. Columbia now 12 nautical miles in altitude, 9 nautical miles downrange.
She's starting to
reading 3,900 feet per second.
Well, we've sort of lost the picture now. Not quite as clear as the picture we had in the past, but now we've got the chase plane.
Now negative seats where altitude is too high for ejection seat use.
It's a beautiful photo of the shot of the white plume coming out of the back of the shuttle.
Columbia, Houston, negative seats. Roger, negative seats.
1 minute, 57 seconds. Columbia now 21 nautical miles in altitude, 21 nautical miles downrange. 2 minutes, 3 seconds. Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
PC 50.
The solid rocket boosters now being separated. There they go. They lift
2 minutes, 14
away
seconds.
from Columbia.
Solid rocket booster separation.
Columbia is now off on its fourth mission into space, and NASA told us all along that practice makes perfect, and Doug Miller, so far, it's gone perfect.
It has gone perfectly. You can tell by the what Shuttle Launch Control has been saying. Very little of substance they've had to say, just everything's going fine, everything's going great.
I know during the first 3 flights, we were always checking our handbooks to find out what various initials meant, what all these anomalies they were talking about.
Right.
This time, we didn't have to look once. All we had to do was listen to you, Harris, count down past the sequences.
They could have recorded this 3 days ago. Went perfectly.
We're about 6 minutes away from the main engine cutoff. At that point, 55 nautical miles high. Of course, the space shuttle will be traveling much higher than that to 130 nautical mile orbit. Right after the main engine cutoff, the external tank will go. The large orange beast will also go up and away from Columbia. We'll be back with that in a minute.
Does your brand of vitamins give you 500 milligrams of vitamin C? Optilex M500 does. What about high-potency B complex and vitamins A, D, and E? Optilex M500 provides all of these important nutrients. Does your brand include iron or zinc? Optilex M500 has both, plus 4 other minerals. So compare Optilex M500 to your vitamin brand. You'll probably find that Optilex has a more complete, more potent formula. Optilex M500 high-potency multivitamin with minerals, sold only in pharmacies. One more question. Does your vitamin brand give you 30 tablets free when you buy 100? Optilex M500 does.
Available at Sage Drugs, Houston.
Columbia now off on its voyage into space, the 7-day mission, the final test flight of this space shuttle. The first American military payload is now going into space. It's a secret payload that the Defense Department won't talk about, but that scientific journals have been talking about for a year. Also the first commercial payload by McDonnell Douglas, an electrophoresis experiment that someday may provide us some help in diabetes research, another experiment that might help in cancer research. We're about 4 minutes away from the main engine cutoff and the separation of that external tank.
That external tank originally was to have been returned to Earth. In the early days of the space shuttle program, they planned to put...
The APUs gimbal the engines. They're powered up. They're going. The onboard computer flying.
46 seconds. We'll stand by for the Press to MECO call up by Capcom Dave Griggs.
Main engine cutoff, MECO they call that.
4 minutes, 55 seconds. Columbia now 57 nautical miles in altitude, 193 nautical miles downrange.
Columbia, Houston, you are go at 5. Roger, go at 5. Stand by for press to MECO.
Simply means keep on, press
Mark.
on.
Press to MECO. Roger, press to MECO.
5 minutes, 16 seconds. The Press to MECO call from Capcom Griggs says, should Columbia lose but one engine, press on, keep flying forward. Columbia's engines have enough energy to achieve normal altitude and velocity at cutoff. Columbia now 58 nautical miles in altitude, 243 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 12,000 feet per second.
In miles an hour, that's about 70% if you want to do the conversion rates. 1 mile per hour figures out about
Mark,
70%.
5 minutes, 45 seconds. Columbia now 58 nautical miles in altitude, 262 nautical miles downrange.
The Larry King Show and CBS's Mystery Theater. The perfect combination for late-night entertainment. Exclusively on your information station, KLBJ AM, Austin.
Now it's time for the Men's Downtown Bible.
They keep an eye on us, and I'm sure we keep an eye on them as well. The question is whether that will interfere with this mission. We'll find out in the next 8 days.
Of course, at the time of the launch, the controls were turned over here in Houston to Mission Control at Johnson Space Center. Of course, there's been talk about moving Mission Control to other sites. Of course, there's been a big shakeup in the management here at the Johnson Space Center, and I think it's safe to say we're entering a new era. And although Lieutenant Colonel Dumel wasn't the one to say that the Air Force is going to take over, I don't think there's any question that they are now taking a bigger and bigger role in America's space program, good or bad.
I think there's going to be perhaps more and more confrontation between the civilian control of NASA and the military control of the Air Force. NASA knowing what side its bread is being buttered on, knowing that with the Reagan administration's emphasis on defense, part of the reason the space shuttle and the space program itself is getting so much attention is because of the potential military exploitation of space. It's going to be an interesting conflict coming up over the next couple of years.
Of course, right now we've lost the picture of the space shuttle, but it's still moving up. We're about a minute away.
Single engine press to MECO.
You are single engine press to MECO.
Roger, single engine press. 7 minutes, 18 seconds. Our report says that Mattingly and Hartsfield can achieve normal engine cutoff targets even if 2 engines go out. 7 minutes, 25 seconds. Columbia now 56 nautical miles in altitude, 515 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 19,900 feet per second.
We're now about a minute and 15 seconds away from the separation of the main booster from the Columbia itself.
G-force is building for Mattingly and Hartsfield now, coming up to 3 Gs. Columbia now 56 nautical miles in altitude, 570 nautical miles downrange.
The Columbia is under a great deal of stress right now because of the angle at which it's going to be orbiting the Earth. It's a much more steep angle, I suppose you'd say, and it's putting a lot more stress on it. And the question becomes, is there any possibility, Wayne, you've been to a couple more of the briefings than I have, is there any possibility that this could cause more stress for the tiles, those troublesome tiles on the space shuttle?
Well, I'm sure that's something they'll be looking at with the cameras once they get up, although they felt that the problems with the tiles the last time was more related to too much Scotchgard, of all things. And, you know, sometimes you look for these real scientific explanations when things go wrong, and it could be something simple like somebody put too much Scotchgard on. There was also a concern during the early shuttle flight. There was too much vibration on the launch pad, and that ice coming off that very cold tank might have had problems with the tiles. They don't feel the dynamic pressure is causing as much problem as the launch itself, and they added water around the platform to sort of absorb some of that shock. Here we go.
Standing by now for external tank separation.
Engines in cutoff.
Confirm confirm external tank separation. Columbia now moving below and beyond the external tank.
Columbia is on its own.
Status check emission control by Flight Director Tom Holloway for the first ohms burn in shutting down the auxiliary power unit.
There will be 4 orbital maneuvering system burns that will take Columbia into its 130 nautical mile orbit into space.
Go for nominal ohms 1. APU shutdown on time.
Well, there you have it. The space shuttle is now free of its rocket boosters, its external tank. It's on its way into space. Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield obviously had a great ride going up. It was picture-perfect takeoff. We're seeing it again here on the NASA monitors. Of course, the folks at Mission Control could see this 100 times and they wouldn't see it enough. It was simply a beautiful launch. Let's hope the next 7 days and that patriotic landing on July 4th will go as well. I'm Wayne Dolcefino, along with Doug Miller. We were glad to bring you live coverage of the launch of Columbia. We'll be bringing you live reports all week long on the experiments and on the final test mission of America's Space Transportation System.
KTRH News covers Houston and the Gulf Coast. The Space Shuttle Columbia lifted off on schedule at 11 o'clock Eastern Time, that's 10 o'clock Houston time this morning, without any hitches or major problems. From the looks of the liftoff, the previous 3 shuttle flights taught NASA technicians a lot about working out the bugs of the blastoff. Astronauts Ken Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield are scheduled to spend 7 days aboard Columbia on its 4th and final test flight, with splashdown set for next Sunday, very appropriately on July 4th. Cleveland.
CBS News, I'm Deborah Potter. A flawless launch this morning of the Space Shuttle Columbia with liftoff right on time.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We should have fire. We have ignition. And we should have liftoff right now. We have liftoff. We have motion. She's clearing the tower. That familiar sight, the flame coming out of a bed of smoke as she's going up into the roll program, pitching over, pitching. You can hear them holler here at the gate.
30 seconds, 1 nautical mile in altitude.
We're shaking now with the blast back from it.
That was CBS News correspondent Reed Collins at Cape Canaveral. The shuttle's been flying smoothly for an hour now, and we get the latest on the mission from Christopher Glenn at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Columbia is coming up shortly on the second orbit of this planned 112 orbit, 7-day mission. And at this point, things couldn't be going more smoothly for the crew, Thomas Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield. In fact, this whole launch day so far couldn't have been more perfect, from the weather at the Cape to the performance of both machines and human beings, through the long, complex countdown procedure to the high drama of the first few minutes of the flight. In a half hour or so, the crew will cautiously crack the payload bay doors open to see if they're working correctly. If so, they'll swing them wide, exposing radiators which siphon off the heat buildup from inside the spacecraft to the deep freeze of space. And then the crew will hear what they want to hear from the ground controllers in Houston. Go for orbit, which translated from the Spaceese means take off your spacesuits and relax, guys. Columbia has done it again, this 4th time flawlessly. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
The first time that America's Space Shuttle was launched on time and without a hitch. The sky was so clear on the ground over the Kennedy Space Center that NASA cameras atop the gantry actually were able to pick up shots of astronauts Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield behind the glass inside the cockpit of the Columbia. So clean has been the mission so far that there's been very little chatter between Mission Control and the Columbia. Now there could be a problem with a Columbia fuel cell. The temperature of the escaping oxygen from that cell is a bit too hot. There's no indication of what this could mean to the scheduled 8-day flight. So far, there's no indication it could be a serious problem. We're waiting word on that right now. Right now, the astronauts are out of touch with Mission Control in one of the scheduled loss of signal periods. They'll be regaining communication shortly with Mission Control. About 30 minutes, they'll get the okay to open that bay door very cautiously, to open up the payload bay door. And soon they'll get their okay to take off their spacesuits, to sit back and relax and know that the Columbia once again is in orbit. Reporting live from the Johnson Space Center, this is Doug Miller, KTRH News.
Is KLBJ AM, Austin, Texas. CBS News, this is Rob Armstrong. The U.S. Space Shuttle Columbia is orbiting the Earth. Astronauts Ken Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield were rocketed into orbit 2 hours ago from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The first time in 4 launches of the Space Shuttle that everything took place on time. Mattingly and Hartsfield say everything is working well. Launch Director Al O'Hara talked to reporters within the past hour and gave an upbeat assessment as the shuttle itself is now in its second orbit flying over Africa.
I thank the Lord for the safety of the crew and the safety of the mission. So I'm just very pleased that it got off on time, obviously, but more importantly, I was pleased that it got off safely. I think America has a right to be very proud of the space shuttle. I think the future is bright, and I'm very optimistic.
For the first time, Columbia is carrying top-secret military experiments on board. If everything continues to go as scheduled, Columbia will return to Earth at Edwards Air Force Base in California on the 4th of July. CBS News continues in 1 minute.
Shuttle Columbia is now soaring into space on its 7-day mission in the final test of America's space transportation system. We have 2 reports from our KTRH news team at the Johnson Space Center, beginning with Doug Miller.
Minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine ignition. 4, 3, 2, 1. And we have solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of America's Space Shuttle on its 4th mission, and we have proved...
Columbia's 4th launch this morning was extraordinary just because it was so ordinary. This is the first time that America's Space Shuttle has blasted off on schedule without any delays. Although a hailstorm last night knocked about 400 dents in the shuttle, those dents were painted over with a galvanizing material that kept the launch on schedule at 10 o'clock this morning. The first flawless launch in shuttle history broke the tension for Launch Director Al O'Hara.
I thank the Lord for the safety of the crew and the safety of the mission. So I'm just very pleased that it got off on time, obviously, but more importantly, I was pleased that it got off safely.
The astronauts were confident, their heartbeats peaking at 110 at launch for both Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield. They're carrying the shuttle's first commercial cargo into space. It's a research package bought by a private citizen, donated to a university that's using that bought and paid-for space on the shuttle for an experiment that could help treatment for diabetes. The astronauts will also test the shuttle's reaction to extreme heat and cold in space. And for the first time, an American space mission is carrying some top-secret cargo, a military mission in space. With me now here at the Johnson Space Center with a report on that is KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino.
The veil of secrecy around Department of Defense Payload 82-1 concerns those who have long found the openness of American space travel one of its greatest qualities. But for the first time, TV pictures from space will be censored to avoid shots of the infrared scanning equipment located in the payload bay of the shuttle. The battle between the public's right to know and the nation's security concerns NASA's assistant shuttle boss, Major General James Abraham. But he says a compromise has been reached.
It's a reasonable and legitimate thing to do since the shuttle is designed to serve the national interest. And the national interest does include the security aspects of military launches as well as the open aspects that we have treasured and have been so important to the NASA mission.
The next Defense Department mission won't come until Space Shuttle Mission number 10, but the military use of the shuttle is expected to grow dramatically in the next few years. Just this week, the Air Force announced the formation of their Space Command to coordinate what could be the next phase of the space race. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
The final test flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia is well underway after a launch from the Kennedy Space Center that went just like clockwork. Astronauts Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield are now nearing the end of their second orbit. ABC's Vic Ratner is at Kennedy. Vic, what's going on now?
Now into their second nighttime, Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield, 130 miles up, are making themselves at home, perhaps catching a snack because there's not really time for a formal lunch. And down here at the Kennedy Space Center, officials have checked the launch pad and found no serious damage. For the first time here, launch directors are looking forward to having 2 spacecraft to get ready this fall. Columbia will be back after its successful mission, and the new Challenger arrives here next month. Now let's go to the Johnson Space Center, which controls this flight, and my colleague Irv Chapman.
It's been going like clockwork at Mission Control, too, Vic. The opening of the payload doors to activate the shuttle's cooling system and expose the experiments to view. The repatching of the spacecraft's computer system for the next phase of its flight. The in-flight working of the electrical generating cells. One after another, they've done what they're supposed to do. The only problem they had came before launch, inspecting the possible damage to those external tiles caused by that thunderstorm, hailstorm at the launch site late yesterday. Damage found to be minimal, didn't delay the launch by even a moment. It's amazing how we've come along, said the launch director, Chet.
Thanks, Irv. That's ABC's Irv Chapman at the Johnson Space Center in Houston and Vic Ratner at Florida's Kennedy Space Center. Now,
CBS News, this is Rob Armstrong. The shuttle Columbia is in space again, all said to be going well. CBS News correspondent Christopher Glenn has the latest from Mission Control in Houston.
Astronauts Mattingly and Hartsfield, aloft for 3 hours now, continue setting up their spacecraft for a week that, while hardly a vacation, will indeed be out of this world. The perfect countdown and launch saw them ride the Columbia to a circular orbit about 149 miles above Earth. They've opened the doors to the big payload bay, exposing radiators to the cold of space, which carry off heat buildup from inside. Now they've taken off their spacesuits and are checking out various systems. Word from the Atlantic Ocean, however, is not so perfect. Teams which were supposed to have retrieved the reusable solid rocket boosters after launch say they sighted them all right in the water, but then they apparently sank. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
Latest from ABC News, I'm Jerry Hamilton. The Space Shuttle Columbia is whirling around Earth in its third orbit, and everything's going very smoothly. The shuttle jettisoned its 2 rocket boosters and lost them. They should have floated in the ocean, but instead they sank. CBS News, I'm Carol Pazewski. The $10 billion shuttle Columbia lifted astronauts Ken Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield into space this morning, a blast-off described as precisely on time and flawless. Soon after the launch, it was discovered, however, that the Columbia had apparently lost its 2 spent booster rockets, meant to be reused on future flights. NASA spokesman John McLeish says the boosters disappeared in the Atlantic.
Recovery forces have not been able to locate either of the twin solid rocket boosters or main parachutes. Initial aircraft sightings indicated that one of the boosters had been located resting low in the water, but a report was later received that it apparently sank. Another sighting indicated that the other booster was floating erect in the water, but later reports implied that it, too, had sunk.
The booster rockets, when fueled up, are worth about $12 million each. When the casings were recovered after previous missions, they were readied for launch at a cost of about $14 million. Now this. Here's the latest from ABC News. I'm Jerry Hamilton. Got off with a roar and a puff of smoke today. ABC's Vic Ratner watched.
There's no waiting for this departure. Columbia is up and away, riding into the sky on a cloud of white smoke and orange exhaust flame. Those 5 rocket engines operating almost at 7 million pounds of thrust, pushing Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield back into their seats. Now punching right through a puffy cloud as Columbia rides into a blue Florida sky. Listen to the roar.
A short while into the orbit, the Columbia jettisoned its 2 rocket boosters. Now, they're supposed to be retrievable, but for some reason both sank to the bottom of the ocean. UPI says a crucial factor in the resignation of Secretary of State Haig was differences with President Reagan over whether the United States should let Israel finish the job in Lebanon. This is ABC News.
CBS News, this is Rob Armstrong. The Space Shuttle Columbia is doing well, orbiting the Earth, with astronauts Ken Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield on board. But one hitch has resulted in an expensive loss for the space program, the sinking of the solid fuel rocket boosters which helped lift Columbia into space this morning. NASA has begun an investigation of the mishap. Correspondent Christopher Glenn reports from Houston.
It'll be a while before anyone can tell for sure what caused the loss of the two solid rocket boosters. The detailed telemetry data is aboard one of the recovery ships, which has to sail back to port in Florida now before the analysis can begin. Some reports say the boosters were spotted in the water, but apparently no one saw them coming down on their parachutes. Many of the chutes used for the boosters this time have been used in previous shuttle flights, so there's some speculation that something might have gone wrong there. The boosters, which have been called history's biggest Roman candles, dropped back to the sea after separating into two separate parts, and the nose cone packages have been picked up. It's the main tanks that sank. Their loss is considered a blow. At best, it costs about $7 million to refurbish the boosters between each flight, but new ones cost about $25 million each. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
Shuttle's two reusable boosters have been lost at sea. Those two solid rocket boosters lied alongside the main engine. They broke away from the main engine right on schedule about 2 minutes after the mission began. They dropped down into the Atlantic, where they were supposed to have been retrieved so that they could be reused on a future mission. But those two boosters have disappeared into the Atlantic, a sunken treasure worth more than $25 million. It's a big loss to the space shuttle program. But Columbia is in orbit. It's doing fine. The launch was flawless until the loss of those solid boosters. Astronaut Ken Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield a few minutes ago fired the last of their orbital maneuvers with no problems. The chatter between Mission Control and Columbia has been silent for the most part. It prompted this exchange right after that last orbital maneuver.
Roger, TK, we're here. Your burn looks good.
I was going to say, things look pretty nice here.
Pretty nice indeed. Columbia is doing well in the fourth orbit of its fourth and final test flight of America's space shuttle. Reporting live at the Johnson Space Center, this is Doug Miller, KTRH News.
Mattingly reporting the fourth orbital burn performed as planned. Columbia now in a circular orbit of 161 nautical miles. At the Johnson Space Center, Houston, our next status report is scheduled for 5:30 Central Daylight Time. This is the NASA Broadcast News Service. Time, STS-4 NASA Broadcast News Service report from the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston. A note to editors follows this status report. As it begins its fourth to make the third burn of its orbital maneuvering system, which will begin moving the orbiter from its current 130 nautical mile high holding orbit to its final orbital altitude of 160 nautical miles. The stable orbital altitude of 160 nautical miles will be achieved with the fourth and final burn of the orbital maneuvering system at 3:15 Central Standard Time, at the end of the fourth orbit. The crew dock their suits at 1:15 Central Standard Time and are working comfortably in the shirt-sleeve environment of the orbiter. All systems are working well. Back at the Kennedy Space Center, search teams looking offshore for the shuttle's twin solid booster rockets have confirmed the loss of both booster rockets, which appear to have sunk in the ocean.
Go ahead, TK. We're listening.
Okay, sir. Any problems? You want to go ahead and take the voice recorders off now? Turn them back on, please.
You have a go for that, TK.
Our next status report is scheduled for 5:30 Central Daylight Time. This is the NASA Broadcast News Service.
This is the latest from ABC News. I'm Jerry Hamilton. The Space Shuttle Columbia is having a smooth flight. ABC's Vic Ratner says it's close to becoming a routine sort of thing.
Columbia demonstrated the reliability that NASA wants to show its future commercial customers by roaring away from its launch pad on time for a picture-perfect trip into space. The astronauts on board didn't even utter a single gee whiz as the rocket climbed into the blue Florida sky. The closest to enthusiasm that Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield got was Mattingly's comment, "Things look pretty nice up here." Only one thing didn't work, nobody knows why. The two solid rocket boosters, which cost $25 million each, sank in the Atlantic Ocean instead of being recovered to be used again. Vic Ratner, ABC News at the Kennedy Space Center.
Late word indicates searchers have now located those rocket boosters, and they're trying to recover them from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. If you'd like to listen to the Columbia astronauts in their air-to-ground communications, AT&T has set up a special telephone number you can call. The number is 900-410-6272. The cost is 50 cents for the first minute, 35 cents for each additional minute. Now this. CBS News. I'm Carol Pozevsky. Space Shuttle Columbia's fourth and last test flight began on time and trouble-free this morning, but soon after liftoff, it was learned that the reusable solid fuel rocket boosters were lost. Now, a NASA spokesman reports the $30 million boosters are under 3,500 feet of water. He said
Columbia's astronauts are flying high and loose right at the moment, higher, in fact, at an altitude of 190 miles than any of the previous shuttle flights. Loose because for the next several hours, they're doing what's called a gravity gradient test, in which the spacecraft is allowed to drift freely in orbit to see which position gravity will pull it to. But they are busy, so busy that they forgot to tell ground controllers whether the maneuvering engines had performed properly to push them into the high orbit.
Columbia, Houston, if you could give us a burn report, we'd listen. I'm sorry, I keep thinking you're watching over our shoulder.
The crew has been activating the various experiments aboard, including, it is presumed, the secret Defense Department package in the cargo bay. Within the hour, it's dinner time, shrimp cocktails, steak, rice pilaf, and butterscotch pudding, then a few more chores before an early bedtime after a long, exciting, and practically perfect first day on orbit. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
$50 million sunken treasure is lost in the Atlantic Ocean. It belongs to NASA. Two solid rocket boosters, those reusable tanks that fed on the sides of the shuttle's main engine during the launch, were supposed to parachute down into the Atlantic and bob on the surface until they could be recovered. But those boosters, worth about $25 million each, are nowhere to be found. The boosters are equipped with a radio transmitter, both of them, but so far NASA's not picked up any signals anywhere from the surface of the water or underneath. They have presumably sunk to the bottom. There's no word on whether they could be reused if they're recovered. Now, beyond that, up in orbit, the flight is nearly picture perfect. Things have been going well. The mission itself, well, they're flying, instead of 165 nautical miles above the Earth, they're flying at 161 nautical miles. That means because they're flying in a lower orbit, the mission, well, they're going to be traveling a bit shorter. The mission will be cut, or at least some of their experiments will be set back by about 15 minutes. They'll have less time in orbit. Therefore, they're going to have less time to perform some of their experiments. In just a couple of minutes, they're going to be turning around to float in as nearly a weightless state as they possibly can, allowing gravity to sort of take over the space shuttle and just see where it floats to. The belly will be facing the sun. It'll be the first thermal test of this particular space shuttle flight. So far, things are going fairly well. Ken Mattingly is about to pull the plug, about to start up some of the getaway special equipment, some of that equipment that's been rented for a university over in Utah. And beyond that, Henry Hartsfield is about to start fixing supper for the Columbia crew. So things are going fairly well at this point. The crew's doing well. They're not very talkative, but everything seems to be going well in the air. If they can just find those boosters, all will be even better on the Columbia's fourth flight. Reporting live from the Johnson Space Center, this is Doug Miller, KTRH News.
CBS News, this this is Rob Armstrong. George Shultz. Shuttle Columbia was rocketed into orbit today from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and already astronauts Ken Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield have conducted a top-secret military experiment on board. NASA officials have said they won't talk about the nature of the military work on the shuttle, and the astronauts themselves were vague and businesslike in their communications with the ground during the test. This is what it sounded like.
Experiment Charlie is on. In any event, select Experiment Charlie power off. Verify Experiment Charlie power LED off. Wait 60 seconds and then execute tab Bravo Charlie.
If that didn't make any sense, that's just the way NASA wanted it. NASA says all future military experiments will also be classified as top secret. The shuttle program was dealt a blow today. The two solid-fuel rocket boosters, supposed to be reusable, landed in the Atlantic after blast-off and apparently sank in more than 3,000 feet of water.
The fourth flight will be about 15 minutes shorter than expected. That's because it's flying lower than was scheduled, about 4 nautical miles lower than planned. The reason, says Flight Director Tom Holloway, is that the launch burned a bit more fuel than expected.
We can accomplish all of our objectives for STS-4 from a wide range of altitudes. And today we elected to operate at a slightly lower altitude to increase our margins on the propulsion budget a little bit.
Well, they're working on some of those military experiments. They have been a bit earlier today. They've been talking in cryptic technical jargon about that. The jargon the Department of Defense wants to keep a secret. It's deliberately hard to understand. And there's a $50 million sunken treasure sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It belongs to NASA. Two boosters, that is, the side fuel tanks that fell into the ocean were supposed to have been retrieved. They've apparently sunk. Now, there's a radio transmitter for each of those boosters, but so far NASA's picked up no indication of where exactly they might be. They're searching right now. They still haven't picked up exactly where they are. They're presumably somewhere at the bottom of the Atlantic. The crew's doing well, and no problems, no serious problems so far reported aboard the fourth flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Reporting live from the Johnson Space Center, this is Doug Miller, KTRH News.
Worth of fuel booster rockets. The rockets were supposed to fall back to Earth and float in the Atlantic Ocean until they were picked up, but instead they sank. Other than that, the launch went off without a hitch this morning. In about an hour and a half, the astronauts will be going to sleep. Cleanup operations are continuing this evening at the Ethel Corporation, where lightning struck a hydrogen cylinder during last night's severe weather and started a fire.
From ABC News, I'm Larry Matthews. Exciting day for astronauts Henry Hartsfield and Ken Mattingly.
It is all the people said it was. It's a beautiful machine.
Mattingly telling Houston about the Space Shuttle Columbia, now in orbit for the fourth time in its final test flight. This one will be a little bit different from the others. Here's
Columbia is higher than it ever has been before, 160 miles up. It's also on a different orbit, one that NASA will need for its paying customers in the future, but one which leaves the astronauts out of touch with Houston more often. The spacecraft is also conducting several scientific experiments, but perhaps the most intriguing one is a secret Defense Department cargo.
ABC's Vic Ratner reports all is well aboard the Columbia tonight.
It's precisely 11 o'clock.
From ABC News, I'm Paul Altmeyer. Scheduled aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia, which was launched Sunday morning from the Kennedy Space Center. It may have been a costly launch. The two reusable rocket boosters sank in the Atlantic. If they cannot be recovered, it will cost about $50 million to replace them. Obviously, that was not part of the scenario of Columbia's mission. As correspondent Vic Ratner reports, this is the fourth and final test mission of the Space Shuttle, and it's different than the earlier ones.
Columbia is doing things a little differently this time, flying higher than it's ever been, 160 miles up, and on a different, more southerly path, which only goes over the southern tip of Florida and Texas. That leaves the astronauts out of touch more than before, but it's also the orbit that NASA needs for most of its future paying customers, the ones that want to put commercial satellites into space. This is, after all, planned as Columbia's last test flight. After this one, the ejection seats and most of the testing gear will be removed and the space plane prepared for paying service. Vic Ratner, ABC News at the Kennedy Space Center.